On October the 2nd, 2013, a group of over 500 refugees from Eritrea and Somalia, who had decided the current threats on their lives were worth a perilous ocean crossing, found their boat filling with water just as they were reaching the shores of an island called Lampedusa in the Mediterranean Sea. Their boat sank within minutes. The sun had set and island locals mistook their cries for the sound of seagulls. Those who survived were in the water for more than 5 hours, using the bodies of those who had died as floats. 368 people drowned, and of those 368, 108 people never even made it out of the boat. Among those who never escaped the bow of the ship was a 20-year-old Eritrean woman who was in the act of giving birth as she drowned. Her water had broken while she was under the waters of the sea, and when rescue divers found her body and the body of her baby, the umbilical cord was still attached. Like many migrants, her identity only became a number. She was number 288, her baby, 289. A journalist who visited Lampedusa after the tragedy was able to locate her partner and the father of her baby. And the partner shared that her name was Johanna, which means congratulations. No congratulations were ever able to be given to her at the birth of her child. Instead, her search for a place of safety and hope ended in a dreadful nightmare. Johanna joins the many women across time and place who have tried to protect their children from the injustice of empires in our world. Some successful, some not. It turns out that those bent on hatred and violence are not even shaken by what their actions do to the children. In fact, children are targeted as a way to communicate that not even the babies of those who are seen as less than should be able to live. In our text for today, we meet two Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, who were in the business of bringing babies into the world during a particularly perilous time in the history of the people of Israel. A new king had risen to power, a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. Joseph had once had the favor of the ruling class in Egypt, and he secured a place of prominence when he interpreted a dream that Pharaoh had about 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And then he subsequently came up with a plan to not only survive the years of famine, but to make the rest of the world depend on them for survival. When Joseph was respected by the Pharaoh, Israel had no reason to fear, for Joseph ensured they would thrive as a people. But after the death of Joseph, the state commitments to the people of Israel were abandoned. The new king of Egypt knows not Joseph, and therefore does not care for the people of Israel or their God. This new king not only does not care for the people of Israel, he's also afraid of them. He believes they are more powerful and numerous than the Egyptians. He was afraid they would fight against them on the side of their enemies in the event of war. He was terribly concerned that they would escape, leaving him without cheap labor to run his empire. He did not want to lose control over their bodies that were being abused for his benefit. And his fear leads him to implement a forced labor policy. He puts ruthless taskmasters in charge of them and enlists them to build supply cities to store up food that they did not have access to. And yet, the more the Israelites were oppressed, the more they multiplied. God was continuing to keep God's promise of making the descendants of Abraham as numerous as the stars. Former U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions sounds a lot like Pharaoh when he was talking at a 2018 law enforcement conference, and he said, "We are not going to let this country be invaded. We will not be stampeded." Our executive orders today continue to sound like Pharaoh. An executive order issued in January of 2025 is entitled "Protecting the American People Against Invasion." It makes the claim that immigrants present, quote, present significant threats to national security and public safety, committing vile and heinous acts against innocent Americans, and that they, quote, abuse the generosity of the American people. Immigration quotas don't work for the Egyptian Pharaoh in our text because the Hebrews' numbers are increasing through childbirth. So Pharaoh gets creative and demands the Hebrew midwives to turn against their own people and to do the very opposite of what they have been trained to do. Pharaoh instructs the Hebrew midwives to kill Hebrew baby boys when they catch them on the birthing stool. Perhaps Pharaoh thought that doing it this way would make it look like all the boys were stillborn. As Zora Neale Hurston says, the birthing beds of Hebrews were matters of state. The Hebrew womb had fallen under the heel of Pharaoh. Hebrew women shuddered with terror at the indifference of their wombs to the Egyptian law. Well, the midwives had a tent meeting, and they talked about what Pharaoh might do to them if they didn't obey his orders. And, they couldn't imagine the horror of murdering the very children they were tasked to help bring into the world. This was their calling. And they also couldn't imagine the horror of being held accountable to God for their actions. So the midwives ultimately decided that they feared God more than they feared any Pharaoh. Even this particularly brutal Pharaoh who is currently sitting on Egypt's throne, so they let the boys live. Dana Smith, in her poem, imagines how the midwives felt and how they had the clarity to carry on. She writes, "We walked, our birthing blankets stained with the fire of far horizons, our stools battered. We'd long since learned to squat for hours, to bleed attention into the quick breath of a slim-hipped girl. We let time slip under our skirts until we billowed. Our minds steeped in women's cries, worn by pure exhaustion, we were raw with tending life. How could Pharaoh's death threats touch us when we touched the dark, strong thighs of the Lion of Judah's women? Had he come near our wombs, waters, we would have snapped his spine, a wishbone for our fingers. Which words of his could make a desert flower? Those women commanded us with an arched back, a raised pelvis." The best part of this story to me is the midwife's cunning response to Pharaoh. When he realizes they have disobeyed his orders, he summons them, and they tell him that, we just can't follow through with this because the Hebrew women are more vigorous than the Egyptian women, and they have the babies before we even get there. So in a brave and defiant move, they answer him dishonestly in order to subvert the empire. Honoring God and the lives of these babies is more important to them, and their whole mission is to let the babies live. You'd think that Pharaoh would have run out of tactics, but rest assured, there is no end to the brutal policies of the world's empires. And now Pharaoh is getting more anxious. He feels more out of control of his subjects, so he decides to move to his last resort. His appeal will be to all people, not just the Hebrew midwives. All Hebrew baby boys are to be thrown into the Nile. And the creative resistance of the Hebrew women continues. One day, a baby is born and his mom hides him for 3 months. And it becomes harder and harder to hide this baby, so she puts him in the Nile, as the king commanded, but she does it in a waterproof basket and floats it down the river, right near the bank where Pharaoh's daughter will be bathing. And the mother sends her daughter along to watch and see what happens to her son. And Pharaoh's daughter discovers the baby in the basket, and she's moved to compassion. But she does more than feel compassion towards him. She too engages in acts of resistance towards her own father's empire. This baby sister has also been well schooled in resistance tactics by the Hebrew women. And so she approaches the Hebrew princess and asks if she wants her to find someone from among the the Egyptian princess, and asks if she wants her to find someone from among the Hebrew women to nurse him. So she goes and gets the baby's very own mother. And the princess pays her to take care of her own child. Talk about ingenuity. Talk about wisdom. Talk about cunning tactics to subvert the empire. These women are tenacious and resourceful. And the irony is that the Pharaoh didn't think the women were dangerous enough to be killed, and yet it's because of them that the people of Israel survive. He probably should have had them floated down the Nile River. The baby is raised by his mother, funded by Pharaoh's bank account, taught the values of the people of Israel, and when he grows up, he gets placed in a prominent place of power in the Egyptian court. He's given the name Moses, a royal Egyptian name. Moses will eventually help the entire people of Israel escape the Nile as he did when he was a baby, all because the Hebrew midwives and the other Hebrew women were brave enough to do everything within their power to let all the babies live. All throughout this text, the people of Israel are forced to answer the question, who will you serve? Their whole lives were bound by the Egyptian empire. They were commanded to serve Master Pharaoh and to help him ensure his death-dealing ways. But the Hebrew midwives and the Hebrew women chose to serve God rather than Pharaoh, even when it meant putting their own lives at risk. They were faithful to God. They creatively made a way when it looked like there was no way forward. And they used their imagination to resist the master and to let the children of God live. We too live in an empire that has been built on the backs of slaves and immigrants. Our leaders complicate matters because they pretend to know Joseph. They pretend to know the God of Israel, though they work against everything God dreams for our world and God's children. The way we police immigrants in this country draws categories of exclusion and walls off certain people, none of which God would condone. As researcher Kelly Little Hernandez says, historically speaking, immigration control is one of the least constitutional and most racist realms of governance in U.S. law and life. Isaac Villegas in Migrant God writes that the ICE agents guard the racialized borders of this country. Immigration police are on the front lines of a culture war about the ethnic composition of our neighborhoods and schools. Immigration policies and policing are about cultural formation, the making of a peoplehood, a racial politics that reaches into the intimacies of our friendships and the makeup of our families, the segregated geographies that regulate who might fall in love with whom, the landscapes of our kinship. La Migra patrol the boundaries of citizenship and of belonging. We've built an entire society that doesn't work without the labor of people who migrate here, but we don't reward them with any sense of safety, security, or belonging. And as we well know, ICE's racist and reckless policing has ramped up across our country, and our government is sending the message that anyone who is brown, can be questioned or harassed or made to disappear. We are faced with the same dilemma the Hebrew midwives were faced with. How can we subvert the empire and help all God's children live? How can we stop Pharaoh's death-dealing ways? We're living in a country where the laws of the land are contrary to God's commands of how we are to live together, and we must learn to be as creative and as cunning as the Hebrew midwives in developing civil disobedience tactics. When Donald Trump sent ICE agents to North Carolina, the first time during his first presidential term to intimidate immigrants, folks who chose to be in solidarity with immigrants developed networks to keep watch and warn of ICE's presence. Isaac Villegas says, mutual care was our natural reaction to Trump's attempt to sever us and to tear apart our peoplehood. Community defense is the reflexive politics of self-protection. Vigilance as a collective posture of anti-violence to preserve a society from those who seek destruction. Our community defense work has felt like a kind of pastoral care, where we become sentinels for each other, watchers appointed by neighbors to stay alert and sound the alarm when our people are in danger. After those raids, Javiera Caballero, the first Latina to sit on Durham City Council, helped the community to strategize how to better help neighbors whose lives were destroyed. And the community defense groups morphed into mutual aid as they developed a solidarity fund for undocumented residents. And these funds were used to assist with things like housing, detention bonds, utility bills, and groceries. And by 2023, with the combined efforts of nonprofits and government agencies and other coalitions, this fund had redistributed more than $1 million over 4 years. Pharaoh is once again rearing his ugly, oppressive head as ICE raids are terrorizing people all over this country right now. And some Americans are chanting right along with Pharaoh, "Look, they are becoming more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them. They will not replace us." Pregnant women, immigrants with and without papers are afraid to seek prenatal care in this climate, and healthcare providers are reporting more pregnancy complications in immigrant communities. In the fall of 2025, Naira Guzman, 22-year-old immigrant from Mexico, had a traumatic labor and delivery of her daughter, and her daughter ended up in the neonatal intensive care unit as she was unable to breathe on her own. Naira's focus, understandably, was on her daughter's health, and she hadn't really been worrying about the ICE raids in her home, which was the greater Chicago area. Naira has a pending asylum petition and a pending application for a visa for victims of crime. But 15 days after giving birth, on October the 20th, 2025, when Naira and her mother and her brother got into their car to make their daily trip to the hospital to see her daughter and to attend a meeting about her prognosis with the doctors, Naira learned that she did need to be worried about the ICE raids near her home. As soon as they buckled in, their car was surrounded by ICE agents who arrested them and took them to a detention center. And even after Naira and her family showed them their work permits and explained where they were going, and it used to be common practice that pregnant women, those who had recently given birth or those who were medically vulnerable, were not placed in detention. But when Trump took office in January of 2025, that practice changed. Naira had limited access to food and water while in detention, and she had to manage her C-section wound and her type 1 diabetes on her own with the supplies that she had in her backpack. She was never given a breast pump. Naira's lawyers were able to successfully get her and her family released from detention because of her health and the health of her baby, but there was still a whole lot of damage done. Naira fell ill with the flu after being released and had to stay away from her daughter for another week as she recovered. Her breast milk also dried up after being denied what she needed in the detention center. Naira's daughter is still in the hospital, and now when Naira goes to visit her each day, she goes filled with fear that she will be detained again. And yet, Naira continues to risk everything to help her daughter live. Shiphrah and Puah's decision to disobey the king led to the freedom of the entire people of Israel. When they decided to disobey the king in order to obey God, they didn't know the ending to the story. When Moses' mother and sister and the princess worked out a plan to let Moses live, they didn't know the ending to the story. When Johanna crossed the Mediterranean Sea to save her own life and that of her unborn child, she didn't know the ending to the story. When the people who started networks of community defense in the Triangle during the first Trump presidency to stand in solidarity with their neighbors, they didn't know the ending to the story. When Javiera Caballero advocated for a system of mutual aid for the immigrant community in Durham and then all over North Carolina, she didn't know the ending to the story. When Naira continues to risk the journey to the hospital every day to take care of her daughter, she doesn't know the ending to the story. When Renee Good showed up to protect her neighbors on the streets of Minneapolis earlier this month, she didn't know the ending to the story. But one thing seems clear to all of these people. They will serve God, even when it means refusing to go along with the laws, rulers, and powers of this world. They will do everything that they can to let the children live. All of God's people are called to find ways to be faithful by creatively resisting the powers of this world when those powers go against what God desires for God's children and God's creation. We are to serve God, and when the leaders and laws of our world go against God's commands, we are to disobey them. We must find our own roles in joining immigrant activist groups, being a part of community defense, looking out for the safety of our neighbors, contributing to mutual aid, and standing in the way and stopping the pharaohs of this administration. We must stand in the way of the unjust immigration laws and policing in our country. As Martin Luther King Jr. was known to say, the time is always right to do what is right. Even when the pharaohs of this world say, don't let the children live, resist evil and injustice and say, let the children of God live. When whiteness like Pharaoh trembles with fear and starts recklessly disappearing people, resist evil and injustice and let the children of God live. When laws, court systems, and judges rule with racist policies, resist evil and injustice and let the children of God live. When people of color are denied access to wealth and resources and fast-tracked to prison, resist evil and injustice and let the children of God live. When hate speech and cruelty is condoned by the king of our land, resist evil and injustice and let the children of God live. When a blind eye is turned to violence because there was a permit, resist evil and injustice and let the children of God live. When we continue to spend our energy and resources trying to wall ourselves off from others, resist evil and injustice and let the children of God live. When our system continues to perpetuate the poor staying poor and the rich getting richer, resist evil and injustice and let the children of God live. Even when we don't know the end of the story, we will keep working to let the children of God live. And as we do so, we must learn to be even more shrewd, even more creative than those who do evil so that we can find a way to let all God's children live and thrive and experience goodness and wholeness. Following the example of the faithful women like Shiphrah, Puah, Johanna, Javiera Caballero, Naira, and Renee Good, we will be a thorn in the side of empire. And then when we get asked by the powers of this world, why have you done this and allowed the children to live? May our answers be as wise and as cunning as Shiphrah's and Puah's answer. May our answer lay bare the truth that we fear God, not the empire, and that we are laboring alongside God to birth the world of God's dreams, a world where all God's children can live. Amen.